What was your question?
I was wondering whether the habit would be an action or a characteristics description of a person, whether it is something in his character or it's an action that he takes.
Yeah, I think it can be both, isn't it?
Yeah.
It can both be a characteristic and it can be an action. I can have a habit of reacting to a colleague in a certain way. It's a kind of characteristic. Mm. So what's the benefits you have from your bad habits?
No benefits.
Huh?
No benefits.
No benefits?
Zero.
No, there is actually.
There is? What? For example, can we have a few examples?
Examples of what?
Benefits from bad habits.
Enjoying life.
So maybe it's not a bad habit after all.
Most of the bad habits that we do is because we enjoy something else in life. That's why it's
Very bored.
Can I have a few examples of bad habits?
Sometimes you get what you want. You have a tantrum or an anger spurt. Sometimes you get what you want.
For a bad habit.
Others might give in.
I use my anger like in a positive direction at times. Use the anger to just drag myself to do something.
It can become a bad habit. Anger has a price, always. To take revenge can be a bad habit, yeah.
And seeing others and then looking at yourself.
Seeing others, comparing with others.
Yeah, comparing or
Comparing is a bad habit, yeah.
the benefit from a bad habit could be excitement.
Yeah. Because what you are addressing is, I googled bad habits, how to change habits, and it's so interesting. You know, you will have many hours behind the computer. I can just recommend you to Google how to change habits. And what most people are saying, that the reason for the bad habits we have are two things: boredom and stress. Boredom, to be bored, and stress. And what I hear you saying is that some habits create some kind of enjoyment because we don't have maybe a healthy source of happiness, for example. We're a little bit bored, so take a shortcut to happiness.
Why are we going to sleep late? Because you're bored
Can be sometimes we oversleep because of boredom.
or just going to sleep like late?
Yeah, yeah. This is, you see, what I'm hearing now is what the next step will be, because if I have a habit, whether it's a personality trait or an action, and I try to change it, but it doesn't happen. It is often because there is something deeper. If it would have been easy, and if it was, I would have changed it long time ago. So there is something behind it. So, and that I need to address the root cause of the bad habit in order to change it. So I wanted you to sit now 5 minutes and do a little digging, and I will explain for you what to do. And I wrote down a few examples. I took up 2 bad habits I sometimes do. And so I have too much to do all the time. And then you ask yourself, what's the reason for that? And I asked myself, what's the reason for that? I wrote down, it's hard to delegate. And then I asked myself, what's the reason for that? Only I can do it. And what's the reason for that? That's ego. And what's the reason for ego? Is insecurity. So no one else can. So I came down to insecurity is the root cause. And you can, for example, another reason for doing too much and hard to delegate was that the others can't do it, right? You don't think they're able to. And what's the reason for that? Because I don't trust them. So lack of trust is another reason. And I took another bad habit, this irritable at work. so irritable, a little bit sort of tired, tense. You know this tense feeling. And I ask myself, what's the reason for this? Saying yes to too many tasks. And what's the reason for that? Afraid of not being good enough. Or afraid of not being accepted by the boss. And that is also insecurity. So that what I would like you to do now is to pick one of the bad habits and ask yourselves, what's the reason for that? And whatever comes to your mind, you write it down and then ask again. Same question, what's the reason for that? And you write down and then ask again, what's the reason for that? And you're not going to share this, so don't worry, you don't need to sort of write something that looks nice to share with your neighbor. This is your private work. So you have a few minutes, ask yourself very easily, what's the reason for this? Clear? Yeah? And what is very important when you do this thinking is that you don't need to solve this now. You're just going to identify it. Don't get into a solving mood. How to solve this. We do it another day, not today. Just look at it. So we take a few more minutes, and if any of you are ready, you can do the same exercise with one or the other bad habits. See where you end. Okay. Is that enough time for everyone? Okay. Is there anyone who maybe want to share what they came up with? Because after a while one starts going in circles, isn't it? So what could be the root cause of many bad habits? What do you think?
They are easy to take it.
Sorry?
They are more easy to take it than good habits. The bad habits, they are easy to take it than bad.
Yes, they are easier. And what's the root cause of some of them?
Boring.
Boring.
They have nothing to do, so you do.
Yeah. And what's the reason for boredom?
No enthusiasm.
Maybe lack of, there's no organization for your life, so this time that you have nothing to do, so you have to.
So why is nothing to do boring?
So go, yeah.
Why is nothing to do wrong?
It's luxury. When you have nothing to do, it's not everybody can not have nothing to do.
Lack of.
But it's pushed to go in the, like, I would not say like bad things, but it's up to the perception of people. I can say it good, I can say it bad. So
Okay, boredom is a reason for it. And what is
The reason for boredom, lack of motivation.
yeah? And what's the reason for lack of motivation? Maybe the reason for lack of motivation sometimes is because I haven't given it time enough to think about it. It's actually lack of understanding of my motivation.
So you're a little lost, basically.
Sorry?
You're a little lost in
Li-
what you're supposed to do.
So that's the reason for you.
No, that can be a reason of boredom.
Yes.
What to do, so
You don't know what to do. Because it's also then lack of understanding of what your task is and what your purpose is. Yeah.
Lack of clarity.
Lack of clarity of what?
What is life?
Of life? Lack of clarity of what life is. So what is life?
Life is giving.
Life is giving. Interesting. Interesting. Any other road courses?
We are thinking that we are always right, I am always right.
You're always right.
Yeah, and also not taking their point of view.
Yes.
I have also mentioned that sometimes there is a superiority complex.
Yes.
Is what I mean.
Yeah. And what's the reason for superiority complex?
Ego.
Ego will come.
Yeah. And what's the reason for ego?
Body consciousness.
This is standard answer. And what's the reason?
The reason for ego.
Yes.
Too much self-confidence.
Inferior complex. Superior
What's the reason for superior? I'm asking this gentleman.
I am more experienced, more knowledgeable, and knowing all
Yes.
the subject matter.
I feel insecurity.
Self-confidence.
Yeah, this is insecurity actually.
No, it's not
It,
Yes,
Yeah.
it is insecurity. Any type of superiority or inferiority complex shows insecurity.
I know it sounds opposite, but sometimes they say that the more empty there is inside, the more I need to cover that up with cleverness, with good intellect, with good knowledge, and it's somewhere insecurity or not being good enough, in a sense. Or most people, actually, for many of you, I reckon the deepest root cause would be fear. And from fear comes insecurity, and from insecurity then ego. And fear is a very, very basic human trait. And there can be fear of rejection. This is very, very basic human feeling today. I'm not saying it's like that always. We know about soul consciousness. But what is opposite of fear?
Brave. Brave.
confidence.
Brave. Be brave. Bold.
Who said love? I agree with you. Opposite of fear, I'm not saying it's true, because all what you're saying is right. But one very, very basic feeling against fear is love. The more love I have, the less fearful I will be. And actually, the more love I have for my own self, the less ego I will have. If I have lots of good feelings for my own self, and if someone comes and criticizes me and say, you're very dominant, you should not be this. If I have a lot of love for myself, I can say, yes, you're right actually, I'm working on it. Can you help me? What do you do when it happens to you? And then you have a friend for life, if you can react.